Welcome back to Questing Beast. I'm Ben. Today we're going to be taking a look at this review copy that I was sent of Vagabonds of Dyfed, which is an RPG that attempts to combine the principles of the OSR style of play with a lot of rules and mechanics that would be familiar to people who play Powered by the Apocalypse games. So let's take a look at the back cover here. It says it's a modern take on fantasy RPGs compatible with the classics. It's a kind of an unusual format. This is a print-on-demand version. As always, I will put a link down in the description below if you'd like to pick up a copy for yourself. But it's a square shape, which is pretty unusual for an RPG. And it has the binding and construction typical of print-on-demand books. So it's solid, though it's a little bit creaky, and it doesn't open all that well because of the glue binding, as you can see. But it's definitely serviceable. So this book was written by Ben Dutter, with design by Ben and Jessica Dutter, and art by Dean Spencer and Per Fulmer. All right, let's start with the first section, which is the basics. Now, all of the art is similar to this. It's very black and white, very high contrast, and it does a fairly good job at evoking the fairly typical high fantasy feel that we're going to get throughout this book. The title is called Vagabonds of Dyfed, but there's no real reference in the book towards why that is. Dyfed is, if I recall correctly, part of Wales, but that doesn't really come up in the book, so I think you can really set this anywhere that you want. So the basic principles of the game, it's nice that it sets it out right here. It's Powered by the Apocalypse / World of Dungeons inspired. I played quite a bit of World of Dungeons back before I got interested in the OSR. World of Dungeons is just a very stripped down version of Dungeon World, where it only has one move. You just roll the 2d6, and it has the same basic mechanics here, 2d6 plus mod, gradients of success. There's only one core move, some of freeform traits instead of attributes. I'll be looking at that in a minute, and supplemental moves as techniques. So it does have a commitment to OSR principles, in that the emphasis is on challenging the players and an impartial DM. So we have impact and ingenuity, where it emphasizes that aspect of player challenge and giving players meaningful choices, along with our basic setup for Powered by the Apocalypse games, where you roll 2d6, you add a modifier, and 6 or less is a miss, where things get worse or turn out bad. 7 to 9 is a partial success, or good with some complication. 10 to 12 is a complete success, as you do it without an issue. 13 or more is a critical success. So that's something that we see in World of Dungeons, and not in a lot of other Powered by the Apocalypse games. Now, the way this basically works is you don't have attributes with ability scores. Instead, you have a bunch of tags. And the more tags that apply to a particular role, each one of those gives a +1. Going into character creation. So here's basically what your character is going to look like. You're going to be defined by a character concept. You're going to have trait tags, an approach, a goal, a gimmick, a background, a foreground, and a weakness. These are all different trait tags. You're going to have a core flaw, a technique, which is like a special ability, a lineage, which is like a species or a background, and you're going to set up your hit points. So here's our basic traits. So you have an approach, a goal, a gimmick, and so on. And it gives you a bunch of examples here that you can use. But one thing that stood out to me right away is that they're not numbered. I would have liked to see these lists be much longer and to all be numbered so you could roll on them and create randomly generated characters. That is an essential principle of the OSR, that you get to be surprised by the characters that you end up with. And I think it's kind of a missed opportunity that wasn't really included. However, there are lots of options if you're into more creating your own character and building them the way that you want them to be. One other thing that I noticed is that the space on these square pages isn't used quite as well as I would have liked it to be. There's a lot of white space. That's true on a lot of pages. There's some pages where you have a page and there's just like 2 paragraphs up at the top. And I would have liked to see the information be a lot more dense and just packed together so that you could look at more information without having to flip around, right? For example, if these margins were smaller, you could have these much bigger lists and have a lot more information per page. We have a bunch of lineages that you can use, and we have a wide variety of techniques. These are all just special abilities. So you can choose to be an adept, which gives you basically like a cantrip. An arcanist allows you to use magic. We have things like assassinate, or having a favored enemy, having an iron stomach, and so on and so forth. As you level up, you're going to be able to choose to get more of these as long as you can justify it based on what your adventures were. Let's going into gameplay here. So we have a summary of the roll results once again. And here's one of the things that is hard for me to square with the OSR. And this just has to do with the way that the Powered by the Apocalypse games work. When you have that 2d6 roll, 7 through 9 is a partial success, right? But the way that the bell curve works, you're going to be rolling 7 through 9s most of the time, which means that the results are definitely tipped in favor of the players, succeeding possibly with a complication. That's just the majority of what's going to happen, especially when you're adding more bonuses due to tags, then that's going to push it even more towards success. Now, I do have a caveat here that he emphasizes that the GM can add negatives to that. So if there's a more difficult situation, you can add, up to a -3 to each of the rolls and push it more towards the failure end of the spectrum. But by and large, the odds are still going to be tipped in favor of the players most of the time, which I think emphasizes, or doesn't emphasize as much as a normal OSR game, the effort of players working towards succeeding by being clever, because the dice themselves are kind of tipped in their favor. We have a impact skill and stance. This is a neat little rule that I think you can apply to a lot of different things. And that's that before you do a roll, before you are in a dangerous situation, you can say how much risk you want to actually put into it. You want to be a high risk, normal, or low risk. Basically, the higher the risk is, greater benefits and greater consequences. And then, so on with low risk. That's a simple little rule, easy to implement in most role-playing games. So it's nice to see that there. We have an advantage and disadvantage system, and it works basically like in Maze Rats or in D&D, where it's just you add an extra die and you take the best 2, or you add an extra die and you take the worst 2, have advantage and disadvantage. Now, my only thing here is I have a similar complaint with D&D 5th edition, is that you have advantage and disadvantage, and you also have adding and subtracting tags, and it's not really clear to me why you need both of those. Right? If you're at a disadvantage, why can't the GM just say, oh, there's a couple things in your environment that count as tags against you, so we're going to subtract a couple numbers from your roll? Why do we need to have both of those? Because it's not clear when you do that and when you do this. So that's one question that I would have. Some basic rules, including engaging with your core flaw. So the GM can engage with your core flaw to put you in trouble, and you can engage with your core flaw to get yourself out of trouble. And so there is definitely some distinct authorial control here that the players can have over the course of the game, which pushes it more towards the story game end of the spectrum, where players can sort of seize control of a scene and do something because it engages with their core flaw. Looking at your character, we have basically how your character sheet is laid out. We have equipment and speed. Now there's a speed rating, which takes into account your armor. Your armor decreases your speed. Holding items in each of your hands also decreases your speed. And your speed value is going to help set up when you have initiative, essentially, what order different characters are going to go in. However, the game also pushes against that by saying that in most combat, the GM simply decides when people go. And it's only when things are really down to the wire that you use speed. So it's not totally clear to me how useful speed is and how concerned players should be with it. We have damage and hit points. It's all quite straightforward. Characters have a fairly low hit point level, which does make it more like OSR because it's much easier to die than it is in games like World of Dungeons or in Dungeon World. And that is a big, important aspect of OSR games, that your actual character's life is on the line very frequently whenever you get into combat. So you need to be very careful and tactical. So it's nice to see that. We have our level gaining system, and it only goes up to level 6. And judging by the way that you gain XP, you're going to be gaining a level roughly every session, I would guess, because it doesn't seem too hard to get 5 XP. After you get each XP, then you lose it all and you have to go up again to the next one. So this would take about 2 sessions, 3 sessions, 4 sessions, 5 sessions. Altogether, it looks like about 15 sessions would be necessary to get up to the highest level, which is, a moderate campaign, but doesn't seem to really be suited for really long-term campaigns, like ones that go on for years and years, because 15 sessions, you can get through that in just a couple months, really. Of course, you could add more levels if you would like to, but your characters are going to become very powerful and have a whole lot of hit points if that continues on. Looking at non-player characters, how to set up NPCs, hirelings, horses, and hounds, combat. So combat works a lot like Dungeon World in that players are doing all of the rolling. So they're rolling to attack or they're rolling to defend, with the dice determining how well they do. Movement is dictated by speed, having to do with the more speed that you have, the more feet that you can move per round. So the way that the PCs deal damage is actually a little bit interesting. You roll your 2 dice and you add your bonus, and if it's high enough, you deal damage. But the better you do, you're either using the lower of the 2 dice you rolled or the higher of the 2 dice you rolled, plus that bonus. That's going to determine your damage. So that keeps damage fairly constrained within a fairly narrow window, but it does allow you to do small damage or big damage depending on how well you rolled. I like that you don't have to roll separate damage dice. It's just based off of the 2d6 that you rolled to see if you hit. We have downtime scenes and social scenes, which can give you XP. Some rules on travel and dungeoneering, some potential weather hazards. We have some moves in Powered by the Apocalypse speak for dealing with weather and hazards. Preparation and planning. We have a planning role here, which I thought was a little bit interesting. It reminded me of the Blades in the Dark roles, where you can sort of create a plan ahead of time and then simply roll to see how well it does. So you simply jump into the scene, and depending on the roll, either your plan worked and you're going to get to a lot of advantage rolls while following out that plan, or it's not going to turn out well and you sort of enter the scene in a really bad position that you're going to have to deal with. And of course, that's a fast way of jumping right into it, but at the same time, it really skips over the actual planning and execution that is so central in OSR games. It skips over players having to MacGyver their way through a situation by looking at what they actually have and then using it in the moment to be creative. And he does seem to realize that, but that is a big push away from the OSR if you're going to be using roles like this. Because one of my favorite things in OSR games is looking at the players and watching them come up with really creative things that I didn't think of in the moment when they're under pressure. And that sort of skips over that. We have rules for magic. There's no real spell list. There's a couple spell-like special abilities that you can get in the technique section at the beginning, but there's no real spell list here. Magic seems to be more freeform in that sense. And there's magical items and scrolls and so on that you could use, but no actual examples are given. Azoth is a magical sort of mana that you can distill out of gold and magical items, and you can use to power your spells and make them more powerful. So I thought that was a little unfortunate that there wasn't an actual spell list. There wasn't a lot of examples of stuff that you could steal and put directly into your game. And I guess that is one complaint I have overall, is that although the rules seem like they would be perfectly workable, looks like they're very solid, there's very little gameable content put into this. And that is something that I really like to see. There's occasionally random tables. For example, there's one in the magic system. Let me go back here. Right, so if things go badly, you can have a mutation. But it's like a D6 table instead of, say, a D100 table, which you would see more commonly in OSR books. I really like books that give you a lot of exciting material that you can use in your game. And this book is much more focused on giving you a set of mechanics. We have some basic equipment. We have rules on making enemies, including rules for converting things from OSR monsters, which is actually really cool. If you're more into playing Powered by the Apocalypse games, then this could be a great guideline for turning those monsters into something that you can easily use. Because the OSR has so many great monsters to steal, it's nice to have that. Converting enemies, and a big list of example enemies. So a variety of monsters showing you how the monster system works. It's not a huge bestiary, but it does give you enough examples that you could pretty easily create your own. And at the very end of the book, we have character archetypes. So these are a little bit like playbooks or pre-gen characters that you can grab and go if you're just starting a game of Vagabonds. However, it was a little odd that there aren't any blank character sheets. Perhaps they're available online, I just haven't seen them, but it is a little odd that they aren't in the book where you could photocopy them. Instead, they just have some pre-gens here. So overall, Vagabonds is really interesting. It does remind me a lot of World of Dungeons. I do like the fact that it uses tags. It's simply another way to deal with the modifiers. But having tags instead of ability scores does force you to look at your character and sort of envision who they are and think about how these tags and how these bits of their backstory and history could be used in creative ways. So it's much less tied down to statistics and more tied into attributes of the character themselves. I've definitely thought of running games like that, so it's kind of nice to see that being used in Vagabonds of Dyfed. On the other hand, I would have liked to see more content that I could have used in my own games, and I would have liked to see, I'm not sure what it could have involved, but some way to push back against that mechanic of having partial success be what players normally roll. Perhaps dividing up the space of the probability curve so that losing was more possible, just to make things a little bit more difficult and to force players to think a little bit harder. Because I really feel that planning and ingenuity is a core element of OSR games. In any case, if you would like to check out Vagabonds of Dyfed, I will put a link down in the description below where you can get it yourself. If you're interested in the OSR, but you're more familiar with Apocalypse games, this could be a really great entry point, and vice versa. It could be a good way to convert back and forth between those two systems, just to try them out and see if you like a different style of play. All right, that's it for this review. Thanks to all my patrons, as usual, for supporting the channel and making all of this possible. And if you guys want to follow and make sure that you see the review that I do next, remember to subscribe and hit that bell icon down below, because that will give you a notification when I make a new review. And the next review is going to be this, which is Do Not Let Us Die in the Dark Night of This Cold Winter, which is a very long title for a book about creating a downtime activity when your players are stuck in the winter between adventures. You can run this as a little mini game that helps you protect villagers during a deadly freezing winter. It's a very interesting idea to have a mini game that works as a downtime activity published as its own book. So I'm very curious to check it out. It's by the creator of HexKit, so I have no doubt of its quality, but I'm very curious to see how he pulls off this trick. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you guys later.